All right, so welcome back. So we are now continuing the Congress of Vienna Part 2 by Historia Civilis. The original video is in the description. If you want to check that one out without the pausing, you are more than welcome to do so, and I highly recommend it. Otherwise, you know the drill. I thank my patrons. And if you can like the video, that'd be helpful. And subscribe so you don't miss notifications. Otherwise, let us continue with this sham of Polish partition and everything else that's already gone on.
Metternich was the chair of the German Committee, and now that the crisis over Poland was resolved, he was finally able to get some real work done. Recall that the Congress...
Something interesting, I like how I'm already pausing, it's amazing. Hanover is technically, the King of England is the ruler of Hanover. I think. Oh my god. Yeah. And then they lose it under Victoria. Is how that one goes.
That the crisis over Poland was resolved, he was finally able to get some real work done. Recall that the Congress of Vienna had agreed to use the 1792 borders as a starting point for negotiations. Well, in 1792, the Holy Roman Empire existed. Metternich had no interest in turning back the clock. The Holy Roman Empire had proved itself to be a totally inept institution when faced with a real threat. The German Committee had the task of figuring out what Central Europe would look like in a post-Holy Roman Empire world. As far as Metternich could see, there were 4 possible paths forward. Option number 1, complete independence for everybody. Option number 2, a German empire united under one government. Option number 3, a loose confederation of German states.
Put your votes in now. What do you think happens? And I was looking at, that's what I was doing. I was looking at the Kingdom of Hanover. It doesn't exist until 1814. However, it is, in fact, under a personal union with the British. And I'm surprised. So it's called the Electric. Okay, so it's called an electric. So this is where actually they get the Kingdom of Hanover with the restoration of King George III to the Hanoverian territories from the Napoleonic era. Okay. So yeah, British actually get the Kingdom of Hanover out of this, it seems. Well, they technically had it before. So, a cadet branch of the House of Welf and a personal union with the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland since 1714. Okay, so now this is making it the actual Kingdom of Hanover that is fully established. Okay, so that's what happened there.
Option number 4, Austria and Prussia expand and conquer their smaller neighbors. All 4 of these options presented problems. If they decided to go with option number 2, a united German empire, Metternich would obviously insist upon a Habsburg emperor. But given recent experience over Saxony, Metternich did not believe that the Prussians would submit to the Austrians like that.
And they would not. They would fight tooth and nail. And if the Prussians were the empire person, then Austria would not accept that and fight them tooth and nail over.
In addition to that, Metternich was getting signals from Castlereagh that the British would not sign off on the creation of a German empire, so option number 2 seemed a dead end. Option number 4, Austria and Prussia conquering their neighbors, didn't seem great either. Such aggressive behavior would frighten all the other great powers, and if any of them tried to protect one of the smaller German states, they would all be at war again. That left option number 1 or option number 3, either complete independence or a loose confederation. Of the 2, Metternich's preference was for a loose confederation. He thought that complete independence would leave Central Europe weak and unable to defend itself.
Not only would it be weak and unable to defend itself, it would be gobbled up either way. It's like, what is Liechtenstein gonna do if somebody invades it? Oh wait, that's right, absolutely nothing, because they don't have a military. Their military is like one dude on the weekends. So again, the smaller your country is, the less military power you have. It's just a simple fact. So for example, Ireland in modern day, military is absolutely tiny. You could take it over by pretty much any power, really. Sorry, Ireland, but that's the sad truth. When the Ireland was under the United Kingdom, that's a little different. They're bigger. They didn't have representation really at all, and they're treated as second-class citizens, but they would be protected because, they are a part of a bigger nation. So yeah, an independent German states not happening. They would all what happened is they would immediately start fighting and being gobbled up by everyone else. And then so
It would only be a matter of time until some outside power went to war with one of Austria's weaker neighbors. And then Austria would intervene, and then we're back in a great power conflict situation. A loose confederation, on the other hand, might be enough to deter meddling from outside powers. If there was to be a German Confederation, Metternich would first need to mend the relationship with Hardenberg. The Prussian duplicity over Saxony had left a sour taste in everyone's mouth, but if the two great powers were to live under the same umbrella, they would have to be friends. Metternich began making his pitch to some of the smaller German states. He found very little resistance. Many felt burned over the Saxony debacle and sought a closer strategic relationship with Austria for their own protection.
This makes sense. If you're a small independent nation right now, a confederation where you are mostly pretty much almost completely independent, but you are in a defensive alliance with every other German state, you can actually take on one of the major powers if blows come to if blows comes to blows.
Metternich's vision for a German Confederation would look like this. All states within the Confederation would maintain their independence, except when it came to matters of military defense. Under the German Confederation, an attack on one would be an attack on all. Any outside power sticking their nose into German affairs would be met with the combined strength of every German state.
Exactly like NATO. An attack on all is an attack on one. It's the exact same thing with NATO with Article 15. An attack on one is an attack on all.
This ruffled some feathers, because it restricted the ability of German states to make alliances with outside powers. Bavaria in particular was upset by this. But Metternich soothed things over by pointing out that this would put them in a military alliance with 38 other German states. Such a thing had not been possible under the Holy Roman Empire, and such a thing would not be possible to anybody out there negotiating on their own. Of course,
it's like try to find a better deal, you don't get one.
Austria and Prussia were to be exempt from this. They had their own goofy reasoning. They had non-German provinces within their respective empires.
They're major powers, they'll make an exception. The bottom line of the story is they are major powers, so they're going to have the exceptions here. It's just the way it goes.
Whatever. The real reason is that they were great powers and reserved the right to make alliances or war as they wished. Austria and Prussia would be the two anchors of the German Confederation, and it was paramount to the survival of the Confederation that the two great powers within it got along. The German Confederation would have a central diet, a legislature, located in the free city of Frankfurt. The Diet was conceived as a sort of United Nations of Germany, where various independent German states would come together and resolve any disputes that might lead to war. They would also work to reduce barriers so that Germans could live and work and write in any German-speaking country without fear. To this end, they created a weak federal legal system to protect certain political rights across borders. Hardenberg of Prussia was surprisingly supportive of this proposal. The German Diet treated Austria and Prussia as equal partners, which was reassuring to an insecure and young power such as Prussia.
So basically, they're able to get mostly what they want out of this with a very loose confederation. Basically, it's just a massive military alliance and some legislative things. But if you're wanting like political rights and stuff, no. That does not exist. The German Revolution will try to make that exist, but it still won't exist.
There were other areas that could not be fully restored under the 1792 borders. Italy had been totally reshaped under French rule, and the Congress of Vienna needed to decide how much French influence was acceptable in the region going forward. At the moment of his defeat, Napoleon had been king of Italy, really northern Italy, and his son had been king of Rome, also northern Italy. and one of his top generals had been the King of Naples, southern Italy. Obviously, this arrangement couldn't continue, but it was not immediately clear what the Congress should do. Metternich and the Austrian Emperor took a particular interest in this. They considered northern Italy Austria's backyard, and Metternich believed that if Austria and France were in constant competition for influence in northern Italy, it would eventually end in another war. Whatever the new political settlement in northern Italy looked like, it had to be able to resist French influence going forward. Metternich spoke to Castlereagh about this, and the two found that they were of the same mind. Castlereagh told him that Britain was not overly concerned about the future of northern Italy, so long as it remained out of reach for the French. The two men came to an agreement. Remembering the Poland-Saxony crisis, Castlereagh said that the British public was in an anti-imperialist mood right now, and so he couldn't appear to support any sweeping annexations of territory. However, Britain had no problem with Austrian hegemony in the region. If Metternich could draw up a plan that only made minor territorial adjustments, wink wink, he could count on Castlereagh's support.
As long as Austria makes minor territorial adjustments, wink wink, Britain can support this because they're not exactly overly concerned with Italy. What that translates to is, as we go back again, Habsburgs rule by their family. If family members are placed on Italian thrones, right, and they are independent, right, Britain will support this. So Austria can get territories in Italy that are independent, but are ruled by Habsburgs, and minor territorial adjustments. So Austria can get some Italian land out of this, and Austria is made basically the hegemony of Italy in one fell swoop.
Once it became clear to all parties that the future of Italy was being discussed, there were calls to replicate the success of the German committee by forming an Italian committee. Metternich and Castlereagh shut this talk down immediately. Per their agreement, the future of Italy would be decided by Metternich alone. This is what he came up with. Austria would conduct a minor territorial adjustment by directly annexing Lombardy and Venice.
And this province down here. And again, a lot of this is where World War I is going to start taking place, is along these territories. So yeah, minor concessions, but it's actually pretty major concessions when you really think about it.
This would add millions of Italians to the Austrian Empire. Metternich knew that the Hungarians would have opposed any deal that added more ethnic Germans to the empire, since it would have upset the delicate balance within Austria. Expanding into northern Italy was seen as politically neutral, so Metternich used this opportunity to beef up Austria by annexing one of the richest parts of Europe. Castlereagh noticed this, but deemed it minor enough to escape the notice of the British public.
Again, books are a thing, right? Printing press has been around, newspapers are around, but again, this isn't like them annexing all of Italy. I mean, it's pretty big concessions. If anybody was paying attention, yeah, they would be like, what are you doing? But
next, Metternich recreated the Duchy of Parma and handed it over to Mary Louise of Austria, the Austrian Emperor's eldest daughter. The fact that she remained the wife of Napoleon was a bit inconvenient, so Metternich carved out a rule so that the duchy would go to some nephew of the Spanish king upon her death. Spain had been upset when Metternich got the authority to reshape northern Italy, and this was Metternich's way of throwing them a bone. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany was also recreated and handed over to the brother of the Austrian Emperor. Similarly, the Duchy of Modena was recreated and handed to some cousin of the Austrian Emperor. Noticing a pattern yet? By doing this, Metternich technically met Castlereagh's requirement to not openly annex all of northern Italy, but it was a bit deceptive. In some cases, the prime ministers of these new states would be Austrian officials hand-picked by Metternich. On paper, these were all independent countries, but in reality, the Austrians were treating northern Italy like a colony.
Yep, like, again, on paper, Poland exists, right? On paper, Italian independence has been assured, right? But Poland is really a Russian territory, and Italy is really just under Austrian influence and control. So,
in addition to all this, Metternich reformed the Papal States, which was an important sticking point to the majority Catholic Austrian Empire. He also strengthened,
which is key, well, for it to survive what's coming up. But basically, the Papal States, if you don't know, is the Pope was a controller of an entire state / nation, whatever you want to call the Papal States. Yeah. God wills it.
And restored the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, as an independent and fairly strong regional power.
And that will come back to bite him in the ass. Because those two, the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, will completely annex and secure the Kingdom of Italy.
They would serve as a buffer against any future French expansion. Finally, Napoleon's former general was eventually removed from southern Italy, and a distant relation of the King of Spain returned to rule the region once more. I should briefly talk about how Napoleon's general was removed from southern Italy. It involves an event known to history as the 100 Days.
Remember, this is Marmont. Also, the 100 Days is Waterloo thingamajigger. Napoleon's, comeback, 100 Days campaign.
Here's a brief summary of what happened. When the Congress of Vienna was like 6 months into negotiations, Napoleon secretly slipped away from his confinement on the island of Elba and landed in southern France. He marched north with maybe 1,000 supporters, but as he advanced, thousands more flocked to his banner. 3 weeks after landing in France, he captured Paris without firing a shot. The Allies had long feared something like this, and in fact, during the last 6 months of negotiations, the great powers had kept their armies mobilized for this very reason. Within hours of Napoleon's disappearance from Elba, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were marching on France. 3 months after Napoleon captured Paris, British and Prussian armies faced the French outside the town of Waterloo in the Netherlands, current-day Belgium. At Waterloo, Napoleon was soundly defeated by the British general Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon fled, and about a month later, he surrendered to the British, who promptly sent him to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where, under the watchful...
He basically was sent there to die. It's near Africa, let's put it that way. It's not exactly South Atlantic, Africa, yeah.
...eye of the British, he would spend the rest of his days. I've been strategically talking around the 100 Days for this entire video, because while it's certainly militarily interesting, and Napoleonically interesting, it's not diplomatically interesting. From the perspective of the Congress of Vienna, the 100 Days were a brief pause in negotiations, after which everyone just picked back up where they left off. Also, and this may annoy some people, but it must be said, the 100 Days were not a particularly close call. When Napoleon captured Paris, he had maybe 50,000 soldiers at his disposal. The Allies had 1 million.
That is true. And as I said, war gamed out today, Napoleon more than likely wins at Waterloo, but that doesn't mean he wins against the 6/7. I don't know. They'll probably call it the 7th coalition at that point, but the 6th coalition. They don't win. Everyone in Europe is literally against them. It doesn't matter what he does. I mean, at that point, it's over. I mean, if the defense of France was very good on his side, but, I mean, he was fighting a losing battle. And maybe if he's able to do everything perfectly, he can defend France and get his throne back. But that's very far-fetched, so.
Naturally, Napoleon immediately began raising 100,000 additional soldiers. But so did the Allies, and by this point, the Allies were faster. If Napoleon had won at Waterloo, there would have been another Waterloo later that summer. If he had won 10 Waterloos, the Allies still would have had him outnumbered. The entire 100 Days was an act of delusion, and there was never a serious threat of a French victory. Anyway,
At least in 100 days, I'll agree with him. Waterloo, Napoleon probably could have won, but
I bring all that up because Napoleon's former general, the King of Naples, sided with Napoleon during the crisis, which gave Metternich a good excuse to remove him from power
Marmont.
and have him executed. So here was the framework for the final settlement. Broadly speaking, Europe would return to its 1792 borders. Russia would swallow up Poland under a strict constitutional arrangement, and Prussia would annex half of Saxony. The Holy Roman Empire would be replaced with the much more practical German Confederation. Northern Italy would become an anti-French zone under Austrian supervision. With negotiations drawing to a close, there was one lingering issue that had not yet been addressed. The British Prime Minister Liverpool instructed Castlereagh to begin discussing slavery. By 1815, the British anti-slavery political movement had truly become a force to be reckoned with. In 1788, a bunch of local abolitionist groups sent Parliament 60,000 signatures calling for the abolition of slavery. In 1815, these same groups gathered almost 1 million signatures, but this time they didn't send them to Parliament. They sent them to Castlereagh in Vienna. One statistic that was not lost on anybody was that the number of signatures sent to Castlereagh was greater than the total number of votes in the last election. This was not simply an act of protest, it was a shot across the bow. By this time, every British city and most British towns had an abolitionist group that was active in local politics. It was not uncommon for the average British voter to hear about the ongoing sin of slavery on a weekly basis in their church and in their newspaper. The issue became impossible to avoid. After one particularly incendiary pamphlet went viral, more than 300,000 women pledged to boycott sugar since it was exclusively produced with slave labor. People were hungry for action, and when the government showed no interest in doing anything, they grabbed at whatever consumer choices might make a difference. Political activism against slavery was so popular in some circles that it became fashionable, literally. This medallion, called the Wedgwood Medallion, was mass-produced in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Men generally wore them around their necks, and women around their wrists or pinned into their hair.
Am I not a man and a brother? One of the most, before like modern, photographs and printing, this was it. This is like the most iconic image you would get at this time. Britain was very anti-slavery, okay? Extremely so in 1815. And then they will get even more extreme, okay? But we have to remember, this is Castlereagh, an imperialist and a colonialist. What do you think his views on this are? Moderate, kind of non-existent. But the British public will eventually force Britain to become one of the countries that completely outlaw slavery first. They will not only do that, they will then send squadrons of naval ships to Africa to enforce African slave trade stops, okay? They will literally attack or seize slave ships in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, right, with the East African Squadron. They will put their money where their mouth is and actually try to stop it. And it does hurt them, right? It really does. But this is one of the times where, British people can be proud that they stood up for ending slavery when no one else would. And they put their money where their mouth was and try to end it. And I could do a whole video on just the British slavery and how it got outlawed. There's an excellent video I saw a while ago on it. Like, for example, when you saw the British flag and you were a slave in the 1840s, 50s, early 30s, you knew that was saving you and rescuing you. And it's more of a Christian. A lot of the people that served in the East African Squadron did so out of a holy kind of duty. It's a Christian obligation to, you can't just enslave people. And they saw it because again, they were dying out there. trying to stop the slave trade. Because again, malaria, you're in the you're in the South Atlantic, and near Africa. It's very, with no modern medicine, the attrition rate there was astronomically high. So when we talk about this, it's important to remember that Britain was one of the pioneers to try and start it. But Castlereagh, no.
The inscription reads, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This image of a man kneeling in chains became the most widely distributed piece of art depicting a black man ever, and the unofficial logo of the anti-slavery movement.
Think about that. Ever.
In 1807, at the end of a political fight that lasted more than 15 years, Britain passed an act that abolished the British slave trade. It did not abolish the act of slavery, but it made it illegal to transport enslaved persons across the Atlantic to the colonies. Advocates believed that without new bodies coming over from Africa, chattel slavery in the colonies would mostly die out within 1 or 2 generations. They were wrong, but it was nevertheless a big deal that Britain finally acknowledged that their goal was to eventually abolish slavery. The abolitionists were correctly not satisfied by this half measure.
They wanted full abolition. They wanted no slavery in the British Empire at all. That's a noble goal. That does not mean for us, do not get that confused, for a single second that they recognize them as their equals. No. That is not what that means. That means they're not a slave. Okay? And that was a very harsh movement that they wanted to pass. Get rid of slavery completely. Okay? And it's an admirable goal. But don't think for a second that means they're equal in any way to a white man in the United Kingdom. Okay? Not for a single second. Don't think that. I don't need to tell you the exploitation that will happen, after slavery ends. It's still bad, right? But they're no longer a slave.
They demanded nothing less than the complete and total abolition of slavery. And as the years went on, their influence only continued to grow. Lord Liverpool inherited this political situation when he became Prime Minister, and he wasn't happy about it. He was holding on to his conservative Whig majority in Parliament by the barest of threads. And now the abolitionists had sent 1 million signatures to his foreign secretary in Vienna. Liverpool didn't really care one way or the other about slavery, but if he didn't give these people something, they might topple his government. He instructed Castlereagh to try to get some anti-slavery commitments into the final agreement at Vienna. Castlereagh approached the 8-member Central Committee, that is, the 5 great powers plus Spain, Portugal, and Sweden, and asked them to include a provision in the final agreement that committed everybody to the eventual abolition of the slave trade. Of those present, only Britain and Sweden had abolished the slave trade. Castlereagh's opening position was that everybody else should adopt Britain's anti-slavery laws. Another way of saying that is that Castlereagh was not committing Britain to any further anti-slavery reforms.
And again, no anti-slavery reforms for Britain, right? You're just coming up to us, which hurts everyone else, okay? That all he's trying to do here is just say that the slave trade cannot happen anymore. That's it, okay? And that hurts every single other nation besides Sweden, right, and Britain. If he went in there and said, Britain wants abolition, complete abolition of slavery in every country that's going to sign this document, Britain loses the most out of that, okay? Britain has a global empire with a lot of slaves in it, and if it sets them free immediately upon the completion of this, a lot more members would have been willing to do something about that, okay? They might have signed and maybe even pledged to do so. Because it really hurts Britain if they do that, but they would have stand up for their morals. They would have put their money where their mouth was. But Castlereagh, again, is an imperialist and a colonialist. Okay, those two things he's very adamant about. And he's kind of half-hearting this. And when you half-heart something that's just going to hurt everyone else and not yourself, I mean, they're like, why would we do that?
This fact was not lost on Castlereagh's negotiating partners. Spain, Portugal, and France threw a fit. France is an interesting case because they had heroically abolished slavery at the beginning of their revolution, and then under Napoleon, they shamefully brought it back. Spain and Portugal were the other two powers most heavily enmeshed with the slave trade. Spain, Portugal, and France argued that Britain only wanted to abolish the slave trade because they had a head start out in the colonies. They also argued that an agreement like this would give the British Navy an excuse to stop and inspect every ship in the Atlantic. In other words, this would all be to Britain's advantage. Castlereagh tried to respond by appealing to morality, but this only incensed them even further. One Spanish diplomat got in Castlereagh's face and told him the English have always been good at making business march alongside honor. Joke's on him, Castlereagh was Irish.
I'm Irish.
Oh man, the Joe Biden.
If we think about this for a moment, Castlereagh could have shown Britain's commitment to the cause by talking about complete and total abolition, which would have hurt Britain more than anyone. If he had walked into the room talking about abolition, he would have had some credibility because he would have been saying, let's all do something difficult together.
Exactly. 100%. Well, let's all do something incredibly difficult, okay? But it is the right thing and it is the moral thing to do. And he would have been like, I mean, he has the moral stance and he has, it's very difficult to do grounds to at least stand on.
But Castlereagh didn't bring up total abolition because he was an imperialist and he wasn't that personally bothered by slavery. After some agonizing negotiations, they agreed to attach a document to the final treaty coming out of Vienna called a Declaration of Intent to Abolish the Slave Trade.
When you have a declaration of something, not binding. If it's not binding, what do you think happens?
At Spain and Portugal's insistence, this declaration would be non-binding, which sucks. Castlereagh was like, if it's non-binding, we're gonna need to show people some specific goals at least. France agreed to abolish the slave trade within 5 years. They would blow right past that deadline. Spain agreed to abolish the slave trade within 8 years, with some pretty large loopholes. They would blow right past that deadline. Portugal would only agree to abolish the slave trade north of the equator. And since they didn't really have any colonies north of the equator, this was pretty much a giant middle finger to the rest of the Congress. Castlereagh also got all of the participants to declare their intention to eradicate slavery once and for all, but they provided absolutely no specifics and no deadlines. A meaningless statement meant to simply soothe public opinion.
And in Russia, they have a lot of serfs, which, for all intents and purposes, it's not like chattel slavery, but it is slavery. Okay, you can't move. You're owned by your landowner. They tell you what to do. They can move you. They can buy you. They can sell you and do all this stuff. Okay, it's a serf. And Russia's really the last people that still have this. They won't abolish it until the 1860s. So there's that. And again, just we'll get around it someday. Wink, wink.
In the end, Britain's attempt to inject anti-slavery commitments into the Congress was a failure. The reason it was a failure is that Castlereagh didn't even really try. He was half-hearted from the start, and his reluctance to come in there with any radical proposals was a signal to the other great powers that Britain wasn't really taking this seriously. It's a shame, because this was a moment when something big could have been accomplished.
This is one of those moments in history that really could have changed the entire world. Could have really put the end of slavery in 1815. America is going to end slavery around a few years before this, I believe, because, again, basically our importation of slaves runs out. That's basically what happens. We had a set date, and it runs out. I believe it's 1805, 1806. But basically, it runs out. And then we can't have any more slaves. That doesn't mean we can't have, or we can't import any more slaves, but that doesn't mean we can't, have slaves. If they enforce this treaty and also America joined in, but they probably won't, this really would, and they abolish slavery altogether, that would have made America really bad, okay? It would have made America seem real backwards, real fast, if they all abolished slavery and they all enforced and they all enforced basically the East African Squadron of basically securing any ships and releasing the slaves that were captured on those ships back into Africa and destroying the ships, right? That really could have moved the world forward a lot faster than we did. And it was like one of those what ifs, because then every single colonial power would have not been able to support the South in our Civil War, and probably would have ended faster.
Britain had serious leverage and serious public support, and Castlereagh didn't use any of it. One of the consequences of Castlereagh's lack of enthusiasm in 1815 was that slavery continued in places like Cuba and Brazil until the late 1880s. That's a lot of lives and a lot of years, and it's a real stain on Castlereagh's record that he didn't really try to do anything about it. But from a purely political standpoint, the anti-slavery negotiations worked. Prime Minister Liverpool now had something to show the discontents back home, and for now, that was enough. The Treaty of Vienna was finalized in June of 1815. All of the great powers signed off on it. The only outlier was Spain, who remained upset over Metternich's heavy-handed treatment of northern Italy. Spain refused to sign the final document, which was unfortunate. But so long as all the great powers were on board, this was deemed acceptable.
And remember, Spain's not a great power anymore, so as long as we all sign, you can piss off, and we really don't care. So exactly what happened, really.
The final treaty was mostly built upon realist principles and created a balance of power with clearly defined spheres of influence that would, hopefully, prevent future great power conflicts. After Vienna, it was widely understood and accepted that if anybody invaded one of those tiny German states, it would automatically mean war with Prussia and Austria. If anybody invaded northern Italy, it would automatically mean war with Austria. If anybody invaded the Netherlands, it would automatically mean war with Britain. If anybody invaded Poland, it would automatically mean war with Russia. The belief was that so long as governments understood what was and wasn't off limits, minor disagreements could be solved diplomatically, and great power conflicts on the scale of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars could be entirely avoided. It was in the interest of all great powers to respect these limitations, and if any great power was found to be acting recklessly or belligerently, it was in the interest of everybody else to put them in their place. After 25 years of chaos and war, the great powers were having a go at stability. This international system that emerged from Vienna is sometimes called the Concert of Europe, as in all of Europe acting in concert or in unison. The next 15 years would put a severe test upon the concert system, and we will see in time whether these frenzied and far-reaching negotiations were worth it.
It relatively keeps peace for a while. All right, so that is the end of the Congress, an amazing video series put together by History Sevilla. So my last little comments there is, it will prevent a massive, major European war for 100 years. Until World War I, they're all not going to fight each other again, at least in the same war. Now, that doesn't mean Austria and Prussia don't fight each other, or Prussia and Russia don't fight each other, but this does actually guarantee stability for around 100 years, mostly. So, hope you guys like my reaction to that video. Hopefully I added something commentary-wise to that. Again, if you want to support this channel, please like, please subscribe, and if you would like to become a Patreon, add to suggest videos and stuff of the such, that is below too. Otherwise, I'll see you people next time, and have a good rest of your day.